Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Truth About Psychiatry. This is episode number 10, and the title of this episode or this video is The Myth of Autism. So, in previous videos, we've done a lot to expose the myth of mental illness, and in this episode, we will expose the myth of autism, which is obviously connected with the myth of mental illness and all of the hoaxes of psychiatry. Now, this particular myth is one that took me a while to discover, although it was always in the back of my mind, or I had a hunch about it. But I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was that didn't seem right about how I heard autism described, or when I met autistic children or so-called autistic children, and just anything like driving down the street and you see a sign up on the side of the street that says, autism. These are the these are the symptoms of autism, and one in 50 children, or however they put it, will have autism. And just the whole marketing of it, something didn't seem right to me, and I assumed it was somehow connected to the myth of mental illness, but I could never quite put my finger on it until I discovered this book, Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna, by Edith Sheffer. I'd just like to read a couple of the promotional blurbs on the back of the dust jacket. So let's see here. Timothy Snyder, author of On Tyranny and Bloodlands, says, quote, "This book is sensational, although its author does not seek sensation. It is a careful work of history, connecting the career of a physician with the intellectual, medical, and political context of Austria in the 1930s and 1940s. That world is not our world, but the connections, the habits of mind, speech, diagnosis, are more powerful than we think. In restoring history to psychology, Sheffer helps us to understand why we classify our children the way we do, and helps us to ask, as we must, just what kind of world are we making for them." Another more praise for Sheffer's book. Simon Baron Cohen, quote, "With insightful, meticulous historical research, Sheffer uncovers how, under Hitler's regime, the profession of psychiatry became the eyes and ears of the Third Reich. This important book should be read by anyone interested in psychology, psychiatry, or medicine, so that we learn from history and do not repeat its terrifying mistakes." Barry M. Prisant says, quote, "Meticulously documented and chilling in its detail, Asperger's Children reveals the consequences of the most extreme abuses of clinical power and authority. In the current age of neurodiversity, this essential work will help us to ensure that the human rights of people with disabilities will never be disregarded again." Sandra Gilman says, quote, "In what will now be considered the definitive study of Asperger and his relationship to the most nefarious aspects of Nazi eugenics, one of our most original historians has laid out the case against our idealizing of any physician without truly understanding their embeddedness in the complex scientific and political world of their time. An important, well-written, and extremely timely book." And finally, Norman M. Neymark, quote, "This revealing book is magnificently written and researched. It also reflects profound thinking about the origins of autism in medical, historical, and cultural terms." So there's some praise for this book, and for good reason, because this book really opened my eyes, helped me understand that missing piece, helped me understand how autism fits into the larger scheme of so-called mental illness and how it fits into the whole scheme of psychiatry. So on my blog, psychiatricsurvivors.wordpress.com, I have a post called The Myth of Autism. And this is my review of Sheffer's book, and I quote from her generously because she, let's see, this, who said it was the definitive work? I think it was the first one. Second one. In any case, one of these people said it was will be the definitive work on autism or on Asperger, and I think that's right. So I highly recommend it, but let me give you a little review and sample of what you'll find. So for many years I've had a hunch about autism, in quote-unquote autism, but I couldn't quite put it into words. In her recently published book, Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna, Edith Sheffer masterfully articulates what I have long suspected: autism is a myth. Like the myth of mental illness in general, the myth of autism has a long, complex, and sordid history. Don't mistake my meaning. The suffering and heartache that accompany any diagnosis of mental illness, autism, or otherwise are very real and incredibly difficult to endure. I have nothing but the utmost respect and compassion for anyone who has passed through such a trial. But as Sheffer's new book demonstrates, the root causes of that suffering may be different from what is commonly supposed. And before I continue, I should note I have friends who have children who have been labeled or diagnosed as autistic. I've met these children in some cases, and I have other friends who have worked in the field of mental health and helping autistic children and so forth. And I'm not in any way. Like I said, I have nothing but compassion and respect for the people who are trying as best they know how to help or to be of service. But I think it's important to shed light on the truth of about autism, on the history of it, so that we have a better grasp of what we're actually doing when we label children or anyone in this manner. So what is autism? As Sheffer explains, quote, the term autism was introduced in 1911 by Eugen Bleuler. We talked about him in the previous episode. A Swiss psychiatrist who used to describe schizophrenic patients who appeared disconnected from the outside world. Hans Aspberger and fellow Austrian-born Leo Kanner were the first physicians to introduce the term autism as a standalone diagnosis to describe certain characteristics of social withdrawal. Others had described similar children, yet referred to them as schizoid. Over the years, a number of psychiatrists became captivated by children who were said to isolate themselves from others and the world around them, and developed different terms to classify them. By that definition, we'd all now in our quarantining, we'd all be schizoid, we'd all be autistic. We're kind of and we'll see how these terms, autism, schizophrenia, and so forth, how they've developed and become. It's basically the water we swim in, the air we breathe. It's so second nature to us now. But what Edith Sheffer helps us to do is to actually try to see or to understand the water we're swimming in or the air that we're breathing. Sheffer leaves out the detail that Bleuler also coined the term schizophrenia, as we talked about in the last episode. Nevertheless, what most of the civilized world now implicitly accepts as scientific medical diagnoses began as nothing more than the tenuous conjecture of a Swiss eugenicist, conjectures that were subsequently amplified and popularized by an Austrian eugenicist and collaborator with the Third Reich. Sheffer's meticulous research regarding the origins of quote-unquote autism reminds us that words and the characters of those who coined them matter. And we've seen in previous episodes, Thomas Saz has been great about revealing the words and the characters of those who coined various so-called mental illnesses, including that of when Freud and Charcot invented the fake diagnosis of hysteria. And there's a lot of weird stuff that went with the fake diagnosis of hysteria. Sheffer concedes that, quote, the ways in which Asperger's work connects to the present is an open question, unquote. Her goal is to bring, quote, historical facts and perspectives to light in order to provide a broader context for conversations about autism today, unquote. In my estimation, Sheffer does more than achieve her goal. She provides convincing evidence that, in the words of her son, who was diagnosed with autism as an infant, quote, autism is not real. Sheffer's son wanted to put an end to the label of autism because, quote, it is not a disability or a diagnosis, it is a stereotype for certain individuals. Sheffer's son was humiliated by the label of autism, and Sheffer's research reveals that, in fact, the primary purpose for the invention of the label was to humiliate and ostracize children who were considered to be abnormal. Sheffer focuses specifically on, quote, the children who face the Third Reich's diagnosis regime, unquote. Her book is about, quote, how Nazi psychiatry judged their minds and determined their fates. It uncovers the nightmarish context of autism's creation, and it reveals how what today appears to be a singular idea rested upon the community that made it. Asperger's diagnosis of autistic psychopathy, Sheffer observes, emerged from the values and institutions of the Third Reich. So, important to keep in mind the many connections between not just autism, but all sorts of connections between psychiatry and the Third Reich. As one of these reviewers mentioned, psychiatry was kind of the eyes and the ears of the Nazi regime, and it's interesting to think of that in terms of a comparison with what Thomas Saz calls psychiatry in America as the therapeutic state. So psychiatry and the state working together against the free and responsible citizen. Thus, the concept of autism fermented in the same national socialist fervor that led to the brutal massacre of millions of innocent people. It passed from Bleuler to Kanner and Aspberger, and unfortunately it was resuscitated by the British psychiatrist Lorna Wing in 1944. Eventually the concept found its way into the 4th edition of the Bible of Psychiatry, that is, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-4. The so-called diagnosis now rears its ugly head in the DSM-5 as Autism Spectrum Disorder. In the 1990s, a new diagnosis regime in the United States spurred an astronomical increase in the rate of diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder. As Sheffer notes, the rate of diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder rose from 1 in 2,500 children in 1985 to 1 in 68 children in 2016. The autism spectrum disorder diagnosis has expanded so rapidly and to such an extent that every human being who has ever lived, now lives, or will yet live may one day find himself or herself somewhere on the spectrum. As I said, with this coronavirus or Wuhan virus pandemic, we might all find ourselves on the spectrum, and the so-called spectrum. And it's also a reminder about what Robert Whittaker had to say about the the bipolar boom, or just the rise in mental illness, or so-called mental illness, um, despite these supposed advances in science, medicine, and psychiatry. In spite of these terrifying statistics, and in spite of his connections to the Third Reich, Asperger has often been depicted as a compassionate progressive and opposed to Nazism. However, the historical record tells a different story. In fact, Asperger played an influential role in Vienna's child euthanasia system. Under his auspices, dozens of children were sent to the Spiegelgrund Children's Institution, a Nazi child-killing facility. Like much of the destruction that issued from Hitler's tyranny, the systematic torture, abuse, and murder of innocent autistic children was carried out with the best of intentions in the name of compassionate and ostensibly in the name of in the name of compassion and ostensibly for the common good. These children received a death sentence because they were deemed unfit for Nazi society. If you call to mind the C.S. Lewis quote that we shared in previous episodes, a tyranny that is exercised for the good of its victims may be the worst of all, because those who tyrannize do so with the approval of their own conscience. So that was also what was going on here in Nazi Vienna. The Third Reich psychiatrists who were basically ostracizing and abusing, torturing, experimenting upon, and in some cases killing children for their own good, or so they claimed. Quote, let's see. These children received a death sentence because they were deemed unfit for Nazi society. Quote, Nazi psychiatrists began to diagnose children who they said had poor Gemüt, who forged weaker social ties and did not align with collectivist expectations. They created a number of diagnoses like autism, such as Gemütsarm, or lacking Gemüt, long before Asperger described autistic psychopathy in 1944, which he too defined as a defect in Gemüt. So this concept of Gemüt was very important in Nazi Germany, Nazi Vienna, and these psychiatrists were basing their findings on supposedly measuring which children had Gemüt and which children didn't. And if you were one of the unfortunate children to be labeled as one that lacked Gemüt, or this, nationalist, socialist feeling, then you were in danger. Sheffer traces how the values and events of the Third Reich shaped Asperger's concept of autistic psychopathy. She examines the long lineage of the diagnosis, linking Asperger's thoughts and actions to the broader world in which he lived. Her book makes an indispensable contribution to our understanding of the concept of autism and its ramifications. Asperger and his colleagues came to believe that they had a moral duty to care for souls, even if that duty impelled them to eliminate, for their own good, souls that they considered to be defective. So again, you see the sense that, even the word psychiatry, medical treatment of the soul, somehow these people come to believe that they're actually, by labeling and abusing and killing these children, they somehow convince themselves that they're actually helping them. And it's good to think of this history, like one of the reviewers said, in terms of not letting history repeat itself. So as self-proclaimed experts on the brains and behaviors of children, Asperger and his colleagues determined who was worthy of life and who would be better off dead. Asperger's idea of autistic psychopathy was a key component of the criteria that were used to make these judgments. But these criteria were almost always vague and subject to change. The ebb and flow of the criteria followed the course of the regime. Quote, it was up to Nazi child psychiatrists such as Asperger to diagnose a child's character against regime norms. Children who did not meet Nazi standards in mind, body, and spirit might face any number of labels. While ideals multiplied, definitions of defects multiplied. They were two sides of the same coin in the Reich's diagnosis regime, unquote. Much of the speculation about the behaviors of the children in Asperger's care was based on the Nazi philosophy of Gemüt. Sheffer explains that, quote, Nazi child psychiatrists use the term Gemüt to express their ideals of social feeling. Gemüt is one of the German language's famously untranslatable words, and its meaning changed dramatically over time. For Nazi thinkers, Gemüt referred to one's fundamental capacity to form deep bonds with other people. It had metaphysical and social connotations. Good Gemüt was essential to one's worth as an individual and the health of the Volk, unquote. Sheffer notes that propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels swooned over Hitler's wonderful vigor, his verve, his zeal, his German Gemüt. Suffice it to say that if Aspberger or one of his colleagues discovered that a child lacked the proper measure of Gemüt, that child was almost certainly condemned to perish. As the Nazi child psychiatrist saw it, the cultivation of Gemüt and the annihilation of those who supposedly lack Gemüt served the sole purpose of strengthening the social organism. One of Asperger's teachers, Paul Schroeder, believed that Gemüt signified love of humanity, and that it determined one's worth to society. The degree of one's richness of Gemüt is one of the most important determinants of the practical usefulness and social value of a person. So this is fascinating. If we think of Gemüt signifying the love of humanity, and I recently read a book by a man named Daniel Mahoney. It's called The Idol of Our Age, in which he describes how the attribute or the gift of Christian charity has been counterfeited into this humanitarian idol that that reminds me of this Gemüt or love of humanity. So, how the concept of love in our time has been transformed, and in some ways mimics Christian charity, real, genuine love, but in many ways is actually the polar opposite because it's detached from the source, namely Christ, and it's also detached from any real connection with human beings on an individual basis, or anyway, read the book, Danny Mahoney, The Idol of Our Age. It reminded me of this, of Gemüt being the love of humanity, and how these Nazi psychiatrists were so keen on emphasizing this love of humanity. Asperger and other Nazi psychiatrists wielded the concept of Gemüt as a weapon against children whose behavior they disliked. It was also regularly evoked as a rationalization for disposing of children who were deemed defective or troublesome. Sheffer notes that theories of Gemüt predated Asperger's invention of the concept of autistic psychopathy, and therefore the idea of autism as a pathology already pervaded Nazi child psychiatry in Germany, and Asperger would name it after Nazism came to Austria. Aspberger, Sheffer writes, likened children he considered to be disabled to waste, boasting that he could remediate youths believed to be irredeemable, or irremediable. Asperger explained, with a coarse sieve, many useful things fall in the much bucket. Take a fine sieve and economize with human souls too. Then slowly, he said, some will become useful people. So, yeah, very disturbing. In the infamous, and it gets more disturbing, so hold on to your seatbelts as I continue. In the infamous Spiegelground child-killing facility, doctors such as Jekelius and Illing experimented probably where we get Jekyll and Hyde. I don't know. Or when was that book written? Anyway, strange name. Jekelius and Illing experimented upon and exterminated children who were labeled as inferior or unworthy of life. Quote, Asperger worked in the midst of his colleagues' human experiments at the Children's Hospital and would have known about their deadly methods, which they touted in prominent journals. He walked past babies in his daily life who were injected, infected, and starved. Unquote. Another doctor, Heinrich Gross, proved that he was worthy of his last name. He emulated Hans Heinz in harvesting and preserving victims' brains. Gross began his collection of children's brains at Spiegelgrund for his own work. Children at Spiegelgrund called Gross, who practiced medicine in military uniform, the Scythe or the Grim Reaper. Gross harvested and jarred more than 400 children's brains for his collection that was later discovered in the Spiegelgrund cellar. That's just horrific. But this was a guy that Asperger was friends with. So, you know, just think of all the connections here, and as we're coming to understand where the term autism came from. Sheffer relates the heart-wrenching stories of several of Asperger's victims. Needless to say, the children did not receive Asperger's diagnoses and examinations as compassionate forms of treatment for their perceived deficiencies. Sheffer notes that Asperger's core idea of autistic psychopathy, finding social interactions difficult to navigate, was also nebulous. It meant basically not fitting in. It was totalizing, yet totally amorphous diagnosis. Survivors of the Spiegelgrund Child Killing Center described the nightmarish tortures or treatments to which they were subjected. But all of the violence and murder that these doctors perpetrated against their innocent victims was done in the name of compassion and the love of humanity. It was all in service of the Volk, or the people. Sheffer indicates that Asperger maintained that he was innocent of any violence. Quote, although Asperger was surrounded by mass murder, he himself was not a direct perpetrator, and so was not compromised. He actually called himself a bit of a hero, unquote. Nevertheless, many of his harsh pronouncements and even his milder judgments were influential in determining the fate and sometimes the demise of dozens of innocent children. These children were ridiculed and rejected because their individuality somehow posed a threat to the Nazi collective. Autism, as it turns out, came to be defined in contrast to Nazism. Asperger, Sheffer writes, was essentially defining autism and Nazism as inverse states of being. After the war, Asperger tried to distance himself from some of his earlier research and theories, but his ideas and writings resurfaced later. In 1981, British psychiatrist Lorna Wing breathed new life into Asperger's diagnosis of autistic psychopathy. She studied Asperger's 1944 thesis, and she applied his research to her patients. When Asperger's work went mainstream, Sheffer writes, it was cleansed of its historical context. Or rather, maybe it went mainstream because it was cleansed of its historical context. Sheffer records that Wing regretted her introduction of Asperger's work, her reintroduction of Asperger's work. Quote, this is what Wing said, I wish I hadn't done it. I would like to throw all labels away, including Asperger's syndrome, and move towards a dimensional approach. Labels don't mean anything because you get such a wide variety of profiles. Unquote. Sheffer also makes the important observation that invented diagnoses influence perceptions of people who are diagnosed, which in turn influences their behavior. Quote, it has been shown that treating a child based on a set of assumptions can affect the behavior of the child. Before long, children's evolving behaviors affect evolving perceptions of a diagnosis, which further affects children's behaviors, and so on. In essence, the Third Reich made up people. Sadly, contemporary psychiatry does the same thing. Furthermore, Sheffer also contends, quote, autism is often a diagnosis of behavior, not of an underlying physiological condition, and it serves an expansive umbrella diagnosis. And I would just say to that, how similar to that is to pretty much every so-called diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, namely that these labels were invented to describe behaviors that some people found objectionable, but they don't pinpoint any underlying physiological condition. And the hunt for those biological markers, as I've mentioned in previous videos, will continue, but it will continue to be fruitless. They won't find, like I've said in previous videos, they're going to find a leprechaun or the tooth fairy before they find any of these underlying physiological conditions for mental illness or autism. Although there are some strange things with autism, since I talked about this earlier too, that a lot of people who are skeptical of vaccines have been criticized as being anti-vaxxers because they believe that vaccines cause autism. And I'm actually sympathetic to that argument insofar as vaccines, certain vaccines or excessive amounts of certain vaccines can cause severe damage. I would just caution anti-vaxxers or people who are labeled as anti-vaxxers not to connect vaccines to autism, because even though there is damage, there has been damage done, that damage shouldn't be described as autism, because as we're learning, there's no such thing as autism, except as a myth that's developed. It would be easy to place the blame for unrelenting expansion of autism diagnosis on Bleuler, Aspberger, Kanner, and other psychiatrists, but Sheffer gently reminds us that we each play a role in society's development of categories and classifications. Quote, specific individuals and professions may name these conditions, but they are not simply foisted upon us. We accept them, perpetuate them, and participate in their creation. When we invoke the autism label, it should be with full knowledge of its origins and implications. So, read Asperger's Children to get the full, more complete knowledge of the origins and implications. So in her new book, Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna, Edith Sheffer has exposed the origins and implications of autism with remarkable clarity and concision. By laying bare the long, complex, and sordid history of autism, she has done more than bring historical facts and perspectives to light, and provided broader context for conversations about autism today. Though she might shy away from such an assessment of her work, she has effectively exposed the myth of autism. Sadly, the myth of autism represents only a fraction of the more encompassing myth of mental illness. Nevertheless, now that the myth of autism is exposed, each of us can do our part to fulfill the noble wish of Sheffer's son, namely to, quote, put an end to the label of autism, unquote. So that's my introduction to the myth of autism, to Asperger's Children, The Origins of Autism in Nazi Vienna by Edith Sheffer there, and highly recommend reading that. So now in this ninth video, we've gone through a lot of the history of psychiatry, some key figures. We've discussed Thomas Saz. We've discussed Bonnie Burstow, Peter Breggin, Robert Whitaker. We've discussed many others. There's a lot more to flesh out in the history of psychiatry, and I will try to do that in future videos with reference to Saz and Burstow and Whitaker, Breggin. They all help paint a much fuller picture than the one we get from psychiatric apologists such as Edward Shorter. So even though Shorter's book is probably the one that people would read in medical schools, or it's not. I'm not certain what people read in medical schools, but um, in my estimation, they should be reading Whitaker, Bregan. Um, they should be reading Saz and Edith Sheffer, so they have a clear understanding of the history of psychiatry. Then there should even be an anti-psychiatry course in medical schools to dissuade or to warn people before they go into the field of psychiatry. Because unfortunately, just like the victims of psychiatry, I think a lot of people who go into the field of psychiatry are maybe well-intentioned people who sincerely want to help others who have what they perceive to be mental illness. So that's part of the tragedy of psychiatry, is with these noble desires and good intentions, that so many people are led into this web, into this trap. Really, it is a terrible trap of psychiatry. And on that note, I was reminded of a quote that I've wanted to share with you by a guy named Henry G. Weaver, about what he calls professional do-gooders. This is sort of in line with what C.S. Lewis talked about with the omnipotent moral busybodies. It's also in line with what we just discussed with Aspberger and his colleagues, who began to perceive themselves as these great saviors of children who lacked Gemüt. So there's, and I think you're beginning to see it a little bit in the some of the attitudes about the Wuhan virus. A lot of really well-intentioned people who are, desperately trying to be professional do-gooders, omnipotent moral busybodies, instead of minding their own business. So this is what Henry G. Weaver has to say, quote, "Most of the major ills of the world have been caused by well-meaning people who ignored the principle of individual freedom, except as applied to themselves, and who were obsessed with fanatical zeal to improve the lot of mankind in the mass through some pet formula of their own. The harm done by ordinary criminals, murderers, gangsters, and thieves is negligible in comparison with the agony inflicted upon human beings by the professional do-gooders, who attempt to set themselves up as gods on earth, and who would ruthlessly force their views on all others with the abiding assurance that the end justifies the means." So I like that, ignoring the principle of individual freedom except as it applied to themselves. And I think that's just human nature. It's always easy to be a freedom lover and to love liberty when it's your liberty. But the truly noble thing is in my mind to love liberty enough to not only love it for yourself, but to defend it for others, or as the true heroes of the past, those who have laid down their lives, whether it be D-Day soldiers, whether it be Revolutionary War heroes, whether it be martyrs for Christianity, or even Christ himself, that he died and gave his life so that we could have freedom, and so that we could choose, and how precious a gift is moral agency, and just makes me think of, being willing to. I think it was Joseph Smith said he was just as willing to die for a person of another faith. I'm paraphrasing here, as he was to die for a quote unquote Mormon or a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he was willing to do that because greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. So I got off on that, just thinking of the contrast between what these omnipotent moral busybodies are trying to do, as opposed to someone who is not just, who doesn't ignore the principle of individual freedom and doesn't just apply the principle of freedom to themselves, but allows others to exercise their agency as well. So that's a little quote there that was connected in my mind to this myth of autism and to other things we talked about, such as the C.S. Lewis quote. And got a lot of great quotes that I've collected over the years. Also, there's a few, maybe I'll do the episode number 10 on, there's a lot of funny things that have been published in TV shows, in comedy skits, poetry, just a lot of things that have been published or produced, broadcasts that also make light of psychiatry, which I've also enjoyed, particularly some of the cartoons. And there's even there are a couple episodes from the Three Stooges that we could talk about. There's an episode from the TV show Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt that's really funny. And there's a lot of popular in pop culture. You'll see some of these references to psychiatry pop up here and there, and perhaps we'll do an episode on that in the future. But that'll be enough for today, and I will see you soon to talk more about the truth about psychiatry.